No one expected what was about to happen when a teacher tried to humiliate a poor student in front of the entire class. But they had no idea what was coming next. It was an ordinary Monday morning at Crestwood High, the kind of day where students dragged themselves into their seats, clutching coffee cups and half-finished homework. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and whispers rippled across the classroom as Mr. Caldwell, the sharp-tongued history teacher, strode in with his usual air of superiority. Before we dive into today's story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's get started. At the back of the room sat Eli, a quiet, thin boy in a faded hoodie, clutching a notebook with frayed edges. He wasn't the loudest, he wasn't the strongest, and most of the time, he blended into the background. But today Mr. Caldwell had a target. "Eli," the teacher's voice cut through the chatter like a knife. "Why don't you stand up and explain to the class why you never seem prepared? Or are you too busy daydreaming about things that don't matter?" Laughter erupted from a few students. Some exchanged uncomfortable glances, others smirked, enjoying the spectacle. Eli's knuckles tightened around his notebook. He shifted in his chair, his face flushing, but he stayed silent. The teacher smirked, pacing like a predator circling its prey. "Didn't think so. This is what happens when you don't try. Remember, class, life doesn't reward the lazy." But what no one realized, not the smirking students, not even the smug teacher, was that Eli was about to turn the entire classroom upside down. And the moment Eli opened his mouth, the entire room shifted. The classroom felt unusually tense that morning, the kind of tension that crackles just before a thunderstorm. Mr. Caldwell, with his crisp suit jacket and perfectly shined shoes, loved that tension. He thrived on it. To him, teaching wasn't about building students up. It was about control. And Eli, the quiet boy with the threadbare hoodie and downcast eyes, was his perfect target. "Eli," Caldwell's voice sliced through the silence again, dripping with sarcasm. "I asked you a question. Or is the concept of responsibility too advanced for you?" A ripple of laughter spread across the room. A group of students in the front row chuckled loudly, emboldened by the teacher's mockery. Others looked down at their desks, uneasy, unwilling to get caught in the crossfire. Caldwell leaned against his desk, arms crossed, eyes fixed on Eli. "Tell me, what do you plan to do with your life if you can't even bring a pencil to class? Do you think success will come knocking on your door while you sit there mute and clueless?" Eli tightened his grip on his notebook. He wanted to disappear, but something inside him refused to bow. His father's words echoed in his mind. "Silence doesn't protect you forever. Sometimes you have to let your voice be heard," the teacher smirked, circling like a hawk. "Or maybe," he continued, "you're one of those kids who thinks the world owes you something. Tell me, Eli, what exactly have you done to deserve success? Enlighten us." The class waited. Some smirked, others fidgeted. It wasn't just a question. It was a trap, a chance for the teacher to crush Eli with whatever words he tried to muster. But Eli didn't flinch. Slowly, he raised his head. His eyes, usually hidden under his messy hair, locked onto Caldwell's with a calm steadiness that made the teacher falter for just a second. "No one owes me anything," Eli said quietly, but with surprising firmness. "But I don't think mocking someone for struggling makes you successful either." The class went silent. A few heads turned sharply, as if they couldn't believe what they'd just heard. Caldwell's smirk stiffened. He hadn't expected Eli to fight back, especially not with composure. He recovered quickly, forcing a laugh. "Oh, that's cute. You've been sitting there mute for months, and suddenly you've found your voice. Tell me, Eli, do you even know the answer to the question I asked earlier? Or are you just deflecting?" Eli didn't rush. He opened his frayed notebook, flipping to a page filled with cramped but detailed notes. "You asked about the economic causes of the Great Depression. The main factors were the stock market crash of 1929, the failure of banks, and a decline in consumer spending. But," he paused, lifting his eyes, "you also asked what I've done to deserve success. I study, I work, I don't give up. That's what I've done." A hush spread across the room. The same students who had laughed moments earlier now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One girl in the back whispered, "He actually answered better than anyone else." Caldwell's jaw tightened. For the first time, his dominance wavered. He straightened, his voice sharper now, more defensive. Anyone can memorize facts. Real success requires discipline, effort, and presentation, qualities you clearly lack. Do you think colleges will be impressed by a boy in a hoodie who can't even look his teacher in the eye? The insult stung, but Eli didn't let it show. He closed his notebook gently and leaned back in his chair. His calmness contrasted starkly with Caldwell's rising aggression. "You say success is about presentation," Eli replied evenly. "But isn't it also about character? About how you treat people? If humiliating students makes you feel powerful, what does that say about your success?" The words hit harder than anyone expected. A couple of students gasped audibly. Someone muttered, "Whoa!" Caldwell's face flushed. He opened his mouth, but no words came immediately. For the first time, his carefully constructed image of control cracked. He forced a laugh, trying to regain ground. "Character? Don't lecture me about character, Eli. You're just a kid who hasn't faced the real world yet. When you grow up, you'll realize life isn't about feelings, it's about results. And right now, your results speak for themselves. Failure." The class waited for Eli to crumble under the weight of the teacher's words. But instead, Eli leaned forward, his voice calm but cutting. "Results matter," he admitted. "But so do people. And right now, everyone in this room is seeing your results." He gestured gently around the classroom. "They're watching how you treat someone who's trying. And I think they're starting to realize something." The audience, the students, shifted again. Murmurs spread. Someone clapped quietly, almost sarcastically at first, but it grew into something else. Acknowledgement. Caldwell's eyes darted around the room, realizing his control was slipping. He slammed his hand against the desk. "Enough, this is my classroom. My rules. You don't get to question my methods." But the damage was done. The balance had shifted. The students weren't laughing anymore. They weren't mocking Eli. They were watching him, respectfully, curiously, some even defiantly, as if silently rooting for him. Eli sat back again, calm as ever. "Maybe, but respect isn't something you can demand. It's something you earn." The words hung in the air like a gavel striking a courtroom bench. For the first time, Mr. Caldwell looked less like the predator and more like the prey. And the class, once an audience for his dominance, was beginning to see Eli in a new light. The classroom air was shifting, and Mr. Caldwell felt it. A teacher who once commanded total obedience was now being challenged by a boy in a hoodie, and worse, the students were paying attention. He could almost feel his authority slipping through his fingers. He couldn't allow that. Not here. Not in front of 30 teenagers who would carry this story down the halls, across lunch tables, and eventually all over social media. If he didn't crush Eli now, his image as the unbreakable teacher would be ruined. Caldwell straightened, his voice booming louder than before. "All right, Eli, you think you're clever. You think you've made some kind of point. But let's stop pretending." He stepped forward, glaring down at the student. "You come in late. You turn in assignments barely scribbled together. You sit there with your hood up like the rules don't apply to you. And now you want this class to believe you're some underdog hero?" The class went quiet again. Eli didn't move, but inside his chest tightened. The teacher was reaching for everything: lateness, appearance, effort, twisting every detail into a narrative of failure. Caldwell smirked, sensing blood in the water. "Tell me, Eli, where do you even see yourself in 5 years? Do you honestly believe anyone's going to take you seriously when you can't even respect the basics right now? Or do you just plan to coast through life blaming others for your lack of discipline?" A few students gasped at the harshness. One girl muttered, "That's too much." Another boy shook his head, whispering, "He's going after him personally now." Caldwell wasn't done. He leaned in, lowering his voice to a cutting whisper, loud enough for the whole class to hear. "Maybe you like being the victim. Maybe that's all you'll ever be." The words stung, sharp as knives. A flush crept up Eli's neck, but he steadied himself. He had expected humiliation. He had expected cruelty. What he hadn't expected was the sudden surge of courage rising inside him. He took a breath. Then he looked up, his voice calm but carrying through the entire room. "You're right about some things. Eli began, his tone surprisingly steady. "I have been late. I have struggled. And I don't look like the kind of student people expect to succeed." Caldwell smirked, thinking he'd won. But Eli wasn't finished. He straightened in his chair, shoulders squaring, voice gaining strength. "But what you don't see is why. You don't know that I work nights at a diner because my mom can't pay the bills alone. You don't know that I walk an hour to school when I miss the bus because I don't have anyone to drive me. You don't know that sometimes the reason my assignments look messy is because I'm finishing them at 3 a.m. after a double shift. So no, I'm not perfect. But lazy? Entitled? That's not me." The classroom froze. You could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. A girl in the front row covered her mouth with her hand. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Eli's eyes never left Caldwell's. "You talk about results. Well, here's one. I'm still here. Still trying. Still working. That is my result." The smirk on Caldwell's face faltered. For a brief second, the teacher looked unsettled. He hadn't expected Eli to turn his weakness into strength. He hadn't expected the boy to expose something raw, something human. But pride wouldn't let Caldwell retreat. His voice rose, sharper now, desperate to regain ground. "That's a touching story, Eli, really. But let's be honest. Life doesn't care about excuses. You think colleges or employers will pat you on the back because you tried? No. They'll laugh in your face. Effort without achievement is meaningless." Eli leaned forward, unshaken. "You call it excuses. I call it context. You're right. Life doesn't hand out trophies for trying. But life also doesn't hand out respect for tearing people down. You say success is about achievement? Then maybe you should ask yourself what you've achieved today, because all I see is a teacher trying to humiliate a student." The words hit like a slap. A boy in the back muttered, "Whoa!" Another girl whispered, "He just said that to him?" Caldwell's face darkened. His authority was slipping further with every word. He tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. "Oh, you're clever, Eli, but clever words don't change reality. You think these kids are impressed? Give it a week. They'll forget this little moment, and you'll still be the same struggling kid at the back of the room." For the first time, Eli allowed himself the faintest smile. Maybe. Or maybe they'll remember that for once. Someone didn't stay silent when you tried to tear them down. Maybe that's worth remembering. A murmur spread across the room. Students shifted, whispering, nodding. A boy clapped softly, not mockingly, but with genuine respect. Another joined. The sound grew, not loud, but enough to fill the air with a subtle rebellion. Caldwell's eyes darted across the room, panic flickering just beneath his anger. He slammed his hand on the desk. "Enough, sit down. All of you!" The clapping stopped, but the energy didn't fade. The students were no longer amused spectators. They were witnesses. Some were even supporters. Eli didn't move. His voice cut through the silence once more. "Respect isn't demanded. It's earned. And today, I think everyone here is deciding who really deserves it." The words echoed like a verdict. Caldwell's jaw clenched. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to compose himself. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was supposed to dominate, to humiliate, to remind everyone who held power in this room. But now, for the first time, the power was slipping through his grasp. Mr. Caldwell's jaw was tight, his posture rigid. His authority was hanging by a thread, and he knew it. Eli's calm defiance had shifted the energy of the room. The students weren't laughing at Eli anymore. They were listening to him. Worse, they were respecting him. And that, for Caldwell, was intolerable. He couldn't let a boy in a ragged hoodie overturn years of carefully cultivated dominance. No, he had to crush Eli, not with insults this time. Those had failed. Not with humiliation. That had backfired. If he was to win back control, he needed something undeniable. Something no clever words could outmaneuver. Something that would expose Eli's supposed ignorance once and for all. Caldwell turned sharply toward the blackboard, grabbed a piece of chalk, and began scrawling furiously. The screech of chalk against slate made several students wince. He wrote an advanced question, far beyond the scope of their current lessons, a twisted, complex problem about the economic ripple effects of the Great Depression tied to obscure monetary policy. When he finished, He slammed the chalk down and faced Eli with a cold, victorious smile. "Since you're suddenly the expert," Caldwell said, his voice dripping with venom, "why don't you explain this to the class? If you're as prepared and hardworking as you claim, then surely this should be easy for you." Gasps rose from the students. They all knew this wasn't fair. The problem was something even college students would struggle with. Eli's classmates exchanged uneasy glances. "Come on," one boy whispered. "Nobody could answer that." "Yeah," another muttered. "He's setting him up to fail." Caldwell folded his arms, smug. He had set the perfect trap, a question so advanced it was designed to humiliate. If Eli stumbled, the illusion of his composure would shatter. The respect he had gained would dissolve. The room was dead silent. All eyes turned to Eli. Eli looked at the board. His heart pounded, but his face remained calm. He studied the complex problem, tracing the variables, the tangled cause and effect that Caldwell had carefully constructed to confuse him. He breathed slowly, letting the tension settle. Then, almost casually, he stood. "You're right," Eli said softly, surprising everyone. "That's a complicated question. Most people in this room, including me, wouldn't know the full answer off the top of their heads." Caldwell smirked, ready to pounce. But Eli raised a hand. "But here's the thing about complicated problems. They're usually built on simple truths. And sometimes, the person asking them is hoping no one notices the flaw in the question itself." The class stirred. Students leaned in, sensing something. Eli turned to the board. "The way you phrase this, Mr. Caldwell, it's misleading. You're asking what single factor led to the collapse of international trade during the Great Depression. But history doesn't work like that. It wasn't one cause. It was a chain reaction. The stock market crash, the bank failures, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, and that last one?" Eli tapped the chalkboard lightly. "That's the flaw in your question. Because tariffs didn't start the collapse, they accelerated it. Your question assumes a false premise." Gasps. A few students' eyes widened. One whispered, "He just caught him." Eli stepped back, voice steady, controlled. "So maybe I can't give you every detail of a graduate-level economics thesis. But I can tell you this. Asking the wrong question doesn't prove someone's ignorant. It proves the person asking is trying too hard to look smart." The class erupted in whispers. One student clapped once sharply. Another joined. The sound spread like sparks catching flame. Caldwell's face went pale, then red. His lips tightened as the applause grew louder. "Quiet!" he barked, but his voice cracked slightly. "This isn't a circus!" But the damage was done. Eli didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice. He simply sat back down, calm and unshaken, as though dismantling an impossible challenge was nothing extraordinary. The applause simmered down, but the energy in the room had shifted completely. Students weren't looking at Caldwell with admiration anymore. They were looking at Eli. One girl leaned to her friend and whispered, "He just destroyed him." Another boy muttered, "Caldwell set the trap and fell into it himself." Caldwell's fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to shout, to reassert control, but his usual weapons, sarcasm, humiliation, superiority, had failed. Worse, Eli had turned his ultimate weapon, the unbeatable intellectual challenge, into proof of his own arrogance. Eli looked at him one last time, his voice quiet but sharp. "You wanted to test me. That's fine. But don't confuse trick questions with real teaching. Because teaching isn't about making students feel small. It's about helping them grow." Silence. Then, applause. Genuine, loud, unstoppable applause. Students who had once been spectators were now standing with Eli. Some banged their desks. Others whistled. The room was alive with energy. Caldwell froze, stunned. For the first time in his career, he wasn't the center of authority. He was the subject of judgment. And at the back of the room, Eli sat quietly, letting the storm unfold around him. And just when everyone thought it was over, Eli dropped a final bombshell. Mr. Caldwell stood frozen in front of the blackboard, the chalk dust still clinging to his fingertips. A moment ago, he had been certain of victory, certain that his complex, carefully crafted question would trap Eli and reduce him to silence. Instead, The boy had not only dismantled the problem, but exposed its flaw, flipping the entire room against him. Now the room buzzed with energy he could no longer command. Students leaned forward, whispering, smirking, even clapping in defiance of his authority. The same faces that once fed on his sarcasm were now lit up with awe, directed not at him, but at Eli. For the first time in years, Caldwell felt something gnawing at his chest. It wasn't just anger, it was fear. He cleared his throat, forcing a brittle laugh. All right. Cute performance, Eli, very dramatic. But let's be clear. This is a classroom, not a courtroom. One clever rebuttal doesn't make you some kind of genius. The words were meant to sting, but they fell flat. Students exchanged looks, unimpressed. The crack in his confidence was showing, and they could all see it. Eli didn't move. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than Caldwell's words. Desperate, Caldwell pressed on. And let's not forget, your grades speak for themselves. A handful of answers here and there won't erase the fact that you've been inconsistent all year. Struggling students don't suddenly turn into scholars overnight. You can't fool me, Eli, and you certainly can't fool them. He gestured toward the class. But the moment he did, he realized his mistake. The students weren't nodding in agreement. They weren't backing him. If anything, they were staring back with skepticism. One boy in the front row muttered, "He's just reaching now." Caldwell's smile faltered. Eli finally rose from his seat. He didn't raise his voice, but every word carried. "You're right, Mr. Caldwell, my grades aren't perfect. I've struggled. Everyone here knows that. But struggling doesn't mean I'm incapable. It means I'm human. And if the measure of a student's worth is perfection, then maybe the real lesson here isn't about history. Maybe it's about how we treat people when they're not perfect." The classroom went silent. A girl in the back whispered, "He's right." Another nodded slowly, eyes fixed on Eli. Eli turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the room. "I'm not asking anyone to see me as a hero. I'm asking them to see the truth. That trying matters. That respect matters. And that humiliating someone for their flaws doesn't make you strong. It makes you weak." The words landed with the weight of a gavel. Students shifted, murmuring agreement. Someone whispered, "Facts." Another smirked, shaking their head at Caldwell. The teacher's face burned red. He could feel control slipping through his hands like sand. His voice sharpened, cracking under the strain. "You think you can stand there and lecture me? You, of all people? You don't have the experience, the discipline, Eli cut in, calm but firm. "No, I don't have your experience, but I don't need it to see what's happening right now. You're not teaching. You're trying to win. And the more you try, the more it shows." The class gasped audibly. A girl put her hand to her mouth. A boy whispered, "He just exposed him." Caldwell's composure crumbled further. His hands fidgeted, his pacing grew erratic. He tried to change the subject, waving a hand dismissively. "Enough of this nonsense. Let's get back to the lesson. We're wasting time." But the students weren't having it. They weren't ready to move on. Their eyes stayed locked on Eli, and Eli seized the moment. He stepped forward slightly, his voice clear, steady, almost echoing in the stunned silence. "You wanted this to be about lessons, Mr. Caldwell, so let's make it one. Lessons aren't just facts on a blackboard. They're about integrity, about respect, about the courage to admit when you're wrong." The students erupted in whispers. Some nodded fiercely, others exchanged wide-eyed looks. The tide had turned fully. Caldwell wasn't just losing control, he was being exposed. He opened his mouth, desperate to respond, but the words tangled in his throat. He had no witty retort, no sarcastic jab that could recover his authority. His weapon of humiliation had been turned against him, leaving him defenseless. Eli didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He let the silence linger, let the weight of the moment settle. Then, softly but firmly, he added, "And maybe that's the lesson all of us needed today." The class fell silent again. But it wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of realization. A slow clap began at the back of the room. One student, then another, then another. Within seconds, the entire classroom filled with applause, real, defiant applause that rattled the walls. Some students even stood, their faces lit with respect, admiration, even awe. Caldwell stood there, stunned, trembling with rage and humiliation. His grip on power, once absolute, had shattered before his eyes. And at the center of it all stood Eli, not loud, not boastful, but unshakably calm. But the final moment of truth was still to come. Mr. Caldwell's hands gripped the edge of his desk so tightly his knuckles turned white. The room still echoed with the students' applause for Eli. And that sound, that thunderous sound of respect redirected away from him, cut deeper than any insult could. His voice trembled with anger, but he forced it into a brittle laugh. "Bravo, Eli! Really, you've put on quite a performance. Theatrics worthy of a stage play. But let's not kid ourselves. This isn't some movie moment. None of this matters. You'll still be the struggling student you've always been, and I'll still be the one standing at the front of this room." He straightened, adjusting his tie with sharp, jerky movements. His words dripped with mockery. "You think a few clever lines make you wise? That applause makes you right? This is a classroom, not a popularity contest. History doesn't care about feelings or respect or your so-called dignity. All that matters is results. And in the real world, Eli, people like you," he sneered, pausing for effect, "get crushed." The room grew tense. Some students shifted uncomfortably. Others shook their heads, disgusted at the cruelty. Eli stood still, unshaken. He let the silence breathe, let Caldwell's words linger and rot in the air. Then, slowly, he raised his gaze and spoke. His tone wasn't angry or defensive. It was calm, measured, devastatingly clear. "You're right about one thing, Mr. Caldwell. This isn't a movie. This is real life. And in real life, teachers are supposed to inspire, not humiliate. They're supposed to guide, not crush. If history doesn't care about respect, then maybe that's why so many people repeat the same mistakes, because the ones meant to teach them cared more about power than about truth." The class stirred. A ripple of whispers spread through the room. Eli's voice grew steadier, stronger. "You say none of this matters? Tell that to everyone sitting here who's finally seen what it looks like when someone stands up against unfairness. Tell them respect doesn't matter. Tell them courage doesn't matter. Because right now, that's what every person in this room will remember long after today. Not your lecture, not your test, but this moment." He gestured lightly toward his classmates. Eyes across the room locked onto him, nodding, whispering, leaning in closer. And as for me being crushed, Eli tilted his head slightly, his calmness sharper than any insult. "If struggling makes me weak, then I'll take weakness. Because at least weakness teaches me how to rise." "But what do you learn when all you do is tear others down?" The words hit like a hammer. Mr. Caldwell opened his mouth to retort, but nothing came. His jaw worked silently, his lips moving without sound. For the first time in years, he had no answer. Eli let the silence stretch, then delivered the final blow. "You wanted to make an example out of me. Congratulations, you did. But the example isn't that I was humiliated. The example is that I stood up and you couldn't break me." The room exploded. Students shot to their feet, clapping, cheering, whistling. Desks rattled from the force of fists pounding in celebration. Some even chanted Eli's name. It was chaos, but not for Eli. For him, it was a calm storm, the kind that comes after a long, grueling fight. He simply lowered his eyes, collected his books, and returned to his seat, his composure unbroken. Mr. Caldwell, on the other hand, stood frozen. His authority, once absolute, had been torn apart in front of the very students he prided himself on controlling. His face was pale, his eyes darting from one student to another as if begging for someone, anyone, to side with him. No one did. The applause rolled on, relentless, shaking the walls. Caldwell finally raised a trembling hand for silence, but it took far longer than usual for the students to comply. And when the room did settle, the silence wasn't his to command. It belonged to Eli. The teacher's voice cracked as he tried to dismiss it all. This is ridiculous. You're children. You don't understand. None of this will matter tomorrow." But even he didn't believe the words anymore. Eli turned his head just enough for his final mic drop line. Calm, unflinching. "Maybe not tomorrow, but it matters today." The students erupted again, louder than before, their cheers echoing down the halls. And in that moment, Mr. Caldwell's downfall was complete. He wasn't just defeated. He was irrelevant. And that's when the real shock came next. For a long, uncomfortable moment, the room sat in silence. The cheering had died down, but the energy still pulsed in the air. Raw, electric, unforgettable. Mr. Caldwell stood stiff, his tie crooked, his face drained of its usual authority. The man who had once thrived on control now looked like a shadow of himself, stranded in the very battlefield he had created. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally, but found only steady stares and folded arms. Finally, with a heavy exhale, he muttered, "Fine. Have it your way." He gathered his papers with shaking hands. A few sheets slipped and fluttered to the floor, but he didn't bother picking them up. For a man so obsessed with appearances, it was the ultimate sign of defeat. He turned on his heel, his shoes echoing against the tile as he pushed through the classroom door. The slam reverberated through the hall. And just like that, Mr. Caldwell, once untouchable, feared, even admired, faded into irrelevance. The students sat stunned. Some whispered, some shook their heads in disbelief. Others exchanged glances that said, "Did that really just happen?" Eli remained in his seat, quiet, steady. He hadn't cheered when the others did, hadn't raised his voice in triumph. Instead, he looked down at his frayed notebook, the very one Caldwell had mocked, and closed it carefully, as if sealing the moment inside forever. Then, slowly, he stood. The room fell silent again, waiting. Eli's voice was calm, but it carried the weight of everything that had just transpired. "You all saw what happened today. It wasn't about me being smarter than Mr. Caldwell or proving him wrong just to win. It was about something bigger. Because the truth is, this could have been any of us." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. He scanned the faces of his classmates, his gaze lingering on those who had laughed earlier, those who had hesitated to step in, those who had remained silent. How many times have we watched someone get mocked or dismissed or crushed and thought, "I'm glad it's not me"? How many times have we stayed quiet because it felt safer? "But silence," he said firmly, "is how injustice survives." The word struck deep. A few students looked down, ashamed. Others nodded, their expressions hardening with newfound resolve. "In the end," Eli continued, "intelligence, merit, and truth always rise above arrogance and manipulation. But only if someone has the courage to stand up, even when their voice shakes, even when they feel small." He paused, his voice softening. "I was terrified today. You probably saw it. But courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about speaking anyway. And if I can do it, so can you." For a heartbeat, the classroom felt less like a place of study and more like a courtroom, a rally, a stage for something far greater than a history lesson. And then the applause came again. Not wild, not chaotic, but steady, powerful, unified. A round of applause that felt like a vow, a promise. Eli smiled faintly, lowering his eyes. He had never wanted to be a hero, but in that moment he became one, and that's where the real story lies. Not in the downfall of a teacher who misused his power, but in the rise of a student who dared to speak when silence would have been easier, because arrogance will always try to shout louder. Manipulation will always try to twist the truth. But time and time again, history shows us truth has a way of cutting through the noise. The real lesson? You don't need to be the loudest in the room. You just need the courage to stand. Now the question is yours. Do you think justice was truly served today? If you believe truth and courage will always rise above arrogance, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and tell us in the comments. Have you ever witnessed someone being humiliated and wished you had spoken up? Because maybe, just maybe, the next Eli could be you.